So first of all, I want to introduce what we're going to do with this crossover thing. This is the original crossover. It is quite sophisticated crossover. You can see the woofer is a third order with 2 inductors and 1 shunt capacitor, and with a notch filter. And the mid-range is a second order with a capacitor for the high pass and the shunt inductor. And the low pass, basically at the high frequency end, is a 0.45 millihenry inductor with a 10 microfarad shunt capacitor. And this 0.33 ohm resistor is to adjust the sensitivity. The tweeter is a third order again, 2 capacitors with a shunt inductor. And again, this 3.3 ohm resistor is to tame down the response of the tweeter to balance the overall frequency response. So here, what I'm going to do is, when I look at the mid-range crossover, I notice they use a very tiny ferrocore inductor here, which is definitely no good. It's easily saturated. So because as you can see, the space is very tight, we won't be able to fit in a large inductor. So what I'm going to do is to remove this part to make it a simple first order crossover for the low end. And the crossover for the woofer, we're going to change this 180 microfarad down to 100 microfarad because we see a dip at the frequency response. And the next thing is that this capacitor, very, very important capacitor, 68 microfarad for the mid-range. They use a non-polarized electrolyte capacitor, which is definitely no good because this will affect the entire speaker quality, sound quality. Much more important than anything else, I believe, in this whole crossover board. So what I'm going to do is I replace it with a film capacitor. I'll show you more detail later on. So make it slightly larger because we changed it to a first order crossover. Make it 78 microfarad in total. So basically 2 capacitors in parallel. One is 50 microfarad, the other is 28 microfarad. I believe this improvement is significant. And again, this is also important because it's in the path of the mid-range. You don't want any saturation, all those kind of distortion. And another thing I'm going to do is I noticed the mid-range slightly higher sensitivity at the 1000 hertz and between 2000 hertz and 1000 hertz. So I'm going to trim it down a little bit by increasing this 0.45 millihenry inductor to 0.55 millihenry inductor. It's quite easy. Basically, just add some turns. I will show you later on how I do it. For the tweeter, I noticed we need to increase a little bit sensitivity and also make the crossover frequency a little bit lower. So I add a 1 microfarad capacitor in parallel with this original 2.2 microfarad. So this is a minor change. You don't have to do this, but I think overall, this is, you definitely want to remove it. This is, I will show you, a very tiny inductor is not for high power application. And this is important. Change the non-polarized capacitor to film capacitor. So these two things are very important. And these three items just try to make the frequency response slightly flatter. So I think overall, the designer, Andrew Jones, have done quite good job, and the component used are high quality component, except for these things. But I think it's limited by the room, because I'll show you this capacitor is very large, and this inductor, if you use a good quality inductor, could be super large as well. So I think the trade-off is basically because of the space inside the box. We start with the woofer crossover. I mentioned we're going to replace this 180 microfarad with this is the 180 microfarad non-polarized, with a 100 microfarad capacitor. It's slightly larger. The voltage are about the same, so it's kind of weird. But anyway, I'm going to replace this one with this one. So we completed the woofer crossover modification. Next, I completed everything on this mid-range and tweeter board, crossover board. Basically, we wire out, remove this 68 microfarad non-polarized capacitor. This is not ideal. We're going to replace with these two in parallel, 150 microfarad with a 28 microfarad, as we mentioned earlier. Here, 50 plus 28, we had about 78 microfarad to replace this one. The mid-range is very, very important, so we don't want this one. Then we're going to put this on the bottom of the speaker, and we'll wire this out so we connect to the capacitors. And then I increased this mid-range inductor from 0.45 millihenry to 0.55 millihenry, as I mentioned here. I also replaced the resistor, this 0.33 ohm resistor, with a 1 ohm resistor. So this one, 0.33 with 1 ohm. So tame down the mid-range slightly. Because the woofer path is significant resistive, and the response of the woofer is slightly lower than the mid-range. So I like to match the sensitivity level. And for that, and I also, of course, removed this inductor I mentioned earlier. This one we disconnected. Ferrite core, very bad, easily saturate, so it's no good. And the last thing we did is add a 1 microfarad, because once we increase this inductor, the crossover point will be slightly lower, so we want to compensate that to use the tweeter move the tweeter crossover slightly lower as well. So originally it's 2.2 microfarad, we increased by 1 microfarad in parallel to make it a 3.2 microfarad. So we try to do minimum job and to make the changes. So this is all we have done. And we're going to put everything together. So we put everything back. You can see the two capacitors, 50 and the 28. We connect through those wires. So I pre-wire those from the crossover board and I leave a loop there so I can cut precisely. No dangling wires. Okay, so this is the woofer crossover. The woofer. We put a woofer back, then we're done. Both speakers crossover were modified, as we mentioned earlier, and both are completed. And I did the measurement, by the way. It's this frequency sweeper with the tube amplifier, and this is what we got. So before modification is the red curve, after modification is the blue curve. So you can see after modification we are very smooth, much smoother and more balanced. We remove some of the dips at the mid-high frequency and slightly tame down the mid-range response. Make it a little bit laid back, which I preferred. And also we improve the bass response. So overall, I think this is satisfactory. So if you want to do anything, just follow my descriptions, and if you have questions, just let me know. Thank you.
在昨日离别的码头，好多梦层层叠叠又斑驳，人在夕阳黄昏后，陪着明月等寂寞。年少痴狂，有时难御晚秋风。经过你，快乐时少，烦恼多。经过我，情深意浓，缘分多。谁说青春不能错？情愿热泪不低头，珍惜曾经拥有，曾经牵过。